Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Deep Dive. We have Nick back with us. Yeah. And so Noah's going to walk out here in a minute. We've got Ashley here.
Hi.
And so real quick, I just want to give a couple announcements. Starting this Sunday, the Sundays of August and September, we will not be doing our live streams on Sunday nights. So if you want to interact with us on Sunday nights during our normal worship service times, we invite you to come in person to hang out with us. It's on the campus of Mid-South Christian College. We meet in the Ducka Memorial Chapel at 7 p.m. on Sunday nights. And I do want to make it clear we will still be live streaming the deep dives. And to say, if you're a little worried about the in-person start in August, we've got a great way to introduce you to everybody, because this week we're just going to have a meal together. We're calling it a family feast night, where we're just going to get together, we're going to have a good meal together and talk, and you get to meet the people that are involved in the Wayfarers family. So I invite you to come in person Sunday night at 7 p.m. And that is all the announcements. So I'll hand it over to Noah for the topic of the evening.
Woo! Yeah. Thanks, Jacob. Thank you so much. Welcome back, Nick. Glad to have you back. How was your vacation?
Vacation was great.
Yeah?
I feel well rested. I was just talking to everybody that I feel like I'm reinvigorated, have some good ideas for what we're going to be doing here at the church. Me and Noah had a long meeting today with all kinds of ideas for the future of the church.
It was great. It was like one
earlier this week. Had a
wonderful sessions.
Had a good meeting with Jacob about some stuff too. So I'm excited, man. Things are looking up. I'm excited for what we got planned for the future.
Me too. Well, today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be walking through some of Nick's sermon that he did on Sunday. Generally, when we have sermon weeks here at Wayfarers, we try and dive a little bit deeper into the sermon that Nick preaches. And so today we're going to kind of be jumping into that. But as well, we're also going to be talking about some things that I feel like will be very fun to talk about, but also very hard to talk about. These are things that Nick and I talk about a lot outside of the podcast and kind of nerd out about, and are really difficult to understand when you first hear them. I took a class here at Mid-South Christian College where a book tried to teach some of these ideas, and Jacob knows this class. That book failed miserably at some of these classes.
That poor author.
At least we're not naming names.
Yeah, we're not naming names. I'm not saying any professor, but it wasn't really the professor's fault. It was mainly the book. It was atrocious, and so we're going to try and redeem that book today. We're going to talk through some of these denser things, and that's what I'm hoping for both Ashley and Jacob, who are not as much in that world of biblical academia. I want you all to keep both me and Nick sane and understandable for what we're going to be talking about. And if you feel like you do not understand a sentence we're saying, stop us and say, hey, I don't understand what's going on here. Let's talk about this a little bit more.
So I'll be prepared to stop you about every 10 seconds.
Fair enough.
I'll probably have like a lot of questions that come to mind. I probably won't be able to get to it all.
That would be perfect. Is any questions you have along the way, bring them up, because I'm sure any viewers or listeners may have a lot of those same questions. And I know I felt that way when I'm listening to a podcast and I have a question that I want to ask. If like the host asks that question, I'm always like, yes, thank you. I was wondering that. So we really want y'all to help play that role for any of the listeners. Any questions you have along the way would be great, because like Noah said, this is for like boring Bible nerds, basically, and we want to make sure. But we think it's good stuff. We think it's really helpful.
My passion with this stuff is that it is practical, and my hope is to take all of the biblical nerdy academic stuff and make it practical for you. So that's what I'm hoping. We'll see if we succeed. If we don't, oh well. But we get an hour to do this. I think it's going to be fun. So you guys ready?
Yeah, it'll be the complete opposite of boring. It'll be great.
I do a podcast called the Boring Bible Podcast, so it might be in the same vein. But
Well, I'm ready to dive in.
Ready to do the deep dive.
All right. So I'm going to start this off with kind of an intro, which is the concept that most people think about with this topic is they start with Paul. And Paul, as you probably know, when you pick up any book like Ephesians or Galatians or Corinthians or any of these types of books, he's dense. Like, he is really hard to understand. And in the world of biblical academia, many, many books have been written that really have been trying to answer a simple question. What was Paul saying?
Even it's like First Peter, there's that passage where he's like, Paul, who writes things many of us don't understand. So it's clear that even for Peter and the early church, Paul was kind of hard to understand.
Right. And so I wanted to actually start out with a question just to kind of get a general idea of the room. Growing up, if you could sum up what Paul was trying to say throughout his letters to the church, what would that be?
So, like, what did we hear growing up?
Yeah, what did you hear in church? If you could sum up what you think Paul is really gung-ho about, what would that be?
Well, to be honest with you, I really didn't grow up in the church. I was kind of like, we went to church on Easter, maybe sometimes on Christmas, so I really didn't hear a whole lot about Paul. So I really didn't know a whole lot about him. As far as what I know now, I think, like, to me, it's like writing the different letters to different churches based on what was going on at the time.
Yeah.
Because I know each church had its issue.
Yeah.
And so he was writing specifically to that church, to that issue, or he was writing to like Timothy, or trying to encourage him through his own ministry, something like that. So I guess the context of it, what I get out of it, is that he was writing letters either to encourage, correct, or to establish some type of truth.
Okay. And is there a specific truth that you feel like is the biggest that he talks about the most?
I don't know. I don't know if I have like one specific truth, because I'm not like a really big Paul scholar. So
Right.
Really sure. If I had to just say anything off the top of my head, I think it was just, I guess when I think about Paul's letters, I see him writing to churches who are kind of deviating from the truth sometime after he left them, and trying to get them back on track, maybe because they were falling astray because of... And
by truth, you mean like the gospel, or what do you mean by that? Like deviating from...
just like the truth of Christ, of how they're supposed to be. So I guess you could say the gospel, because I don't know the right way to word this, because I've never had somebody, ask.
No. This is...
But I guess it's just the truth of like how Christ wanted us to live, or what we're supposed to believe, and not being swayed just because I'm not there. It's kind of like, like when you have a parent who leaves, like they follow the rules when I'm there, and then they leave home, and then it's like basically they throw a buck wild party, or like all hell breaks loose, however you want to refer to it. So it's sort of like I want to make sure that even when I'm not around, that you guys understand how to live your life appropriately, because I'm not always going to be there.
I got you.
Guess.
Yeah, that's great. What about you, Nick? What growing up, what was like the main thing you thought Paul was trying to communicate to the church?
Yeah, I grew up in a church that used the books of Paul a lot. That's probably what we spent more time in than any other book of the Bible, any other of the books of the Bible.
Right.
Between the Old Testament, between Peter and Luke and Matthew and Mark and the other authors of the book, Paul was the center of a lot of our preaching growing up. And, what I always heard was kind of the big message of Paul was also synonymous with what most people would say the message of the gospel is. And for most people, it was just, we're all sinners. It's impossible for us to do what God wants us to do. So we need Jesus to atone for those sins through his death.
What do you mean by atone? Like, what would they?
He has to take the punishment that was supposed to come for those sins.
Okay.
Someone had to be punished. Jesus had to be punished because of our sins. And now, what you do doesn't matter. It just matters whether you believe in Jesus.
Okay.
I think that's how most people would say. That's how most people would explain, I think, the gospel.
Yeah.
And by extension, I think that's for a lot of people what they think Paul was saying
a lot of the time.
It's, like Ashley was pointing out, he is writing really situational letters to very specific churches in very specific times. But if you had to be like, what's the message of Paul? I think most people would be like, the message of Paul was that good news gospel message explained. Growing up, at least, it was explained the way I
explained
said it.
Cool. What do you think it was for you, Jacob?
Well, so I had a pretty similar church background as Nick. I think they really spent a lot of time in Paul, which now, as I'm trying to think about what I remember growing up that they preached about Paul, I feel embarrassed.
Oh, really?
That I don't remember.
Well, that's usually, as a kid, I will be fully honest, I hated Paul as a kid, because I couldn't understand him at all. Yeah. It was not until I hit college years that I really even gave Paul a chance. So
yeah, but I will say a lot of what I do remember from when I was an older teenager and stuff. A lot of, I think, what most people would say is that salvation through grace and
not by works.
Yeah,
and unpack that a little bit, just what do you mean by salvation by grace? What
so the idea of the big argument of, do you have to work to be better, or can you just simply believe and salvation covers you? And a lot of times, a lot of people focus on Paul heavily, and the idea that if you simply believe and by grace, that's all it takes. You're saved. You're right to go. And there's nothing. Well, at least they don't talk about. There are arguments that can be made when you look at Paul. He does expect a living out of it, but they don't often point to those as many times.
Right. So for that, then, for your context, they were very concerned with salvation and whether or not you're going to heaven or hell.
Yeah.
And so thinking Paul was on that vein.
Yeah. Okay. And so they would probably, along the lines of that, of the idea that Paul really preached the idea that you are saved by grace if you believe in Christ, believe in Christ, the good news. Kind of what Nick was saying a little bit, that good news gospel preaching is what Paul did. Of course, I will also agree with both Nick and Ashley about the whole idea. Each letter is its own context. Paul is writing to a church for a specific issue.
That's too nuanced, Jacob. We can't have that kind of wisdom here. Paul was saying the same thing in every single letter. We all know that.
But hearing you and Nick say that, I guess it makes me think about, I guess since you all believe that was kind of the basis of his letters, I wonder if he was writing that, I guess, so earnestly because of his own situation before, Christ called him to do what he did, because, before he was persecuting the church and imprisoning people, killing people, and it just, and then when he gets knocked off the horse and then he, is blinded for 3 days and fast for 3 days, and then God still calls him to do what he wants to do. It's when I was doing all these, I guess, great works, or what I thought was great works, I was completely wrong. And then, but yet at the end of that, I still had grace that gave me salvation. So, because I know that Paul even emphasizes that he was the least of all Christians, and, so on and so forth. So it's he's just emphasizing that because of my personal experience, I know this for a fact, and I want people to understand that. So
that's a great point. With everybody, our life circumstances will determine what's most important to us. Yeah. And I think, like Noah was saying, Paul is hard to understand, but most people who read him feel like there's got to be something that was driving this guy. What was his main motivation?
One, it helps us simplify and able to try and understand it a little better if we can put it in small boxes like that.
Yeah.
So,
and like you were saying, his life story is definitely a big part of what kind of helped guide him to the what's this motivating factor. Yeah. So that's been the question everybody's been trying to figure out is obviously Paul has a lot of confusing things he says in a lot of different places, but what's the central
belief
that's at his core, that's this is what drives me, this is why I'm out there suffering for the cause of Christ, this is why I'm writing this letters, this is what's most important.
Right. And that's my point, is asking all three of you all had similar, both Nick and Jacob had more similar answers than I think Ashley did, but all of y'all have a slightly different perspective on what Paul's main thing is, and this is what has created this kind of monster, I will say, in biblical academia, is many people have been asked that question, and many people have come up with different answers, reading Paul and understanding Paul. And today what we're going to do is we're going to kind of walk through some of those. So I will say, just for just kind of general knowledge, I also grew up in the context that Nick and Jacob grew up in, where Paul's message was really focused on salvation. And that's been kind of the typical way that churches in America for the last 100, 200 years really have focused, as they've thought Paul was really focused on how to be saved and whether or not to go to, how you make sure you're going to heaven and how you don't make sure you're going to hell, and how does the law maybe fit into that, which we'll get into in a second because he talks about the law quite a bit. And that's kind of the predominant way that it was taught to me as well. There have been, in the last 100 years, really, it's really new, there have been newer ways of looking at Paul that are very different than that old way of thinking. And a lot of newer people have come on the scene saying that Paul is not as concerned with, are you going to heaven or are you going to hell, when he's writing these letters to these churches. Instead, he's concerned with more actually along the line of what Ashley was saying, very situational events that are happening at each specific church. And he's way more concerned primarily with unity. In particular, that's why we've been going through Ephesians, right? Ephesians has been kind of a text that over the last couple weeks we've been reading, and you can see that there is a focus in Paul to have this church unite over Jew and Gentile differences, right? They are struggling between these Jew and Gentile differences, and so Paul is writing this letter to try and unite those differences to one another. And a lot of people have gotten to Ephesians 2:8, right, in the past, and they have almost pulled that outside of the context of what Paul's trying to say with unity, and have used Ephesians 2:8 to build up a theology. Paul's really talking about salvation in this thing, and not related, well, why is Ephesians 2:8 in a book about unity? And that's what a lot of these newer writers have been trying to do. All right, I'm going to stop there. Is anyone lost, or how are we doing? How are we doing?
I just want to clarify. So Ephesians 2:8, is that when he's talking about
I'll read it.
Yeah.
I'll read it so that we don't just keep referencing it. Because this is what my sermon was on Sunday. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of the deep dive we're actually doing here specifically. Yeah. Ephesians 2 verse 8 says, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast."
Yep.
So those two verses, a lot of people pull those two verses out and they say, if we had to just be like, what is Paul's message? This is it. Mm-hmm. And that those two verses, understood a particular way, is the message of Paul in all of the books that he writes. Right. It's that too. That's when you get Paul at his simplest, most. And for a lot of people, those are the verses they reference for.
Right.
What's the gospel? They say.
Yeah.
For you've been saved through faith, by faith through grace, not by works, so that no one can boast. Sorry, by grace through faith.
That's great.
So I really focused in on that verse as a quick introduction to, as Noah was saying, some of the things that are going on in the sort of cutting edge Bible nerd world in all the universities and areas where people spend, years of their lives arguing about specific Hebrew and Greek words and, all that kind of stuff, where it can get really, really in the weeds.
Which we won't go there.
No.
Not today.
But in that world, people have been asking themselves the question, are those verses really the ones that could represent the center of Paul's message? Mm-hmm. And if they are, do they even mean what we think they mean?
Right.
And so Noah touched on one of the things that is a part of that, which is, for most people, they think those verses are about salvation. And there have been some perspectives recently where people are saying, I don't know if those verses are talking about salvation necessarily.
Right.
So Noah figured we could kind of go through some of the new perspectives that have come up and explain a little bit of that current perspective as well.
Right.
I was thinking the easiest way to organize it is there's really 4 major perspectives right now. Mm-hmm. So I figured we could just spend a little bit of time on each of the
Right.
four.
Let me make this point real quick, though. The reason this is practical, by the way, is when we figure out what Paul is really trying to get at in his letters, that then can influence what the church should be talking about the most. And if I asked y'all the question, what did y'all grow up hearing that Paul was talking about? A lot of it was saved by grace, right? And these people are coming on the scene and saying, maybe Paul wasn't as much about saved by grace as he is about unity in the church. And maybe as a church, we should focus more on unity than that saved by grace idea. Not saying that saved by grace isn't in Paul, but maybe we should focus more on that unity part that Paul's talking about as opposed to the saved by grace, right? And so that's kind of where it comes in practical, is where should the church be focusing in on in our day and age with what Paul was saying. What was most important to Paul should be most important to the church. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. All right, cool. So let's go ahead and Nick, if you want to explain what the first of the new perspective views.
Well, I thought first I'll just do a quick explanation of the old perspective.
Oh, yeah.
I was going to ask if we could do that first.
We'll just do a quick explanation of the old perspective, which is probably the perspective most of us heard growing in church. So the old perspective is based heavily on the reformers, Martin Luther, John Calvin, Zwingli, several of the others that came in the Reformation, where you got sort of the Reformed split away from the Catholic Church. I will say, if you actually go read the Reformers, they have some thoughts that are much more nuanced than what I'm going to say. So I'm not saying this is actually what they're saying, but it's definitely the roots of it. And the basic message at that point in time is that Paul was super upset at people who were legalists, people who were obsessed with rules, and people who were obsessed with religion. What I said on Sunday is, for most people, it's religion versus relationship. And the issue for Paul was religion, wherever that may be. And so that was the Jews, especially, because they had all these sacrifices and all these rules and all these things that they do. But it wasn't just limited to them. It could be anybody. Anybody who's trying to earn their way to heaven, they would say that's what Paul was angry about. Paul was super angry that anyone would try to earn their way to heaven, and he wanted to make it extra clear that's impossible. You can't do it. The only way to do it is through grace, which is what you said before, which is a nice fancy theology word that just means it's a gift from God. It's not something you earn, and you accept that gift by believing in Jesus. And so that has been the old perspective. Most people have read all of Paul's letters through that lens in some way or another. So in Romans, in Galatians, in Ephesians, whatever it might be, that's kind of at the center of Paul's message. And a lot of that is kind of the standard way of thinking about it. If we've grown up in church, we'd be like, yeah, that's not that controversial. We'd be like, that's what the gospel is, right? Right. And so I think because of that reason, it was hard for a lot of people to question it. But the reality is that there are several verses within Paul and within other parts of the scriptures that make that view of Paul kind of difficult and hard to really fully agree with. One of the biggest things is that Paul, when he says, when he's talking about the religion, like we said before, he uses this particular phrase, which is works of the law. Works of the law. And so the first new perspective, which is just called the new perspective on Paul, is really focused on that phrase, works of the law. And their belief was that Paul is not talking about all works. He is specifically talking about works of the law. So he's not talking about any religious striving. He's not talking about trying to earn your way to heaven. He's talking about specifically works, as in actions, from the Jewish Torah specifically. And that they think the misstep was that the reformers took that idea and expanded it to any sort of striving or earning or desiring to
so to more simplify that, the reformers saw it as working towards salvation is bad, it's all by grace, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this new perspective is saying that no, works of the law doesn't mean working towards salvation. Works of the law means something else. And what does
Yes.
that mean again?
And for them specifically, what they say works of the law means is that they say it's specifically related to the things that the Jews did to separate themselves out from the other nations.
Mm-hmm.
So they circumcised themselves, they ate kosher, they didn't eat pig and other things like that. They did not work on the Sabbath, and they kept just kind of specific boundary line markers between them and the Gentile world. And so they argue that specifically when Paul says works, when he says works of the law, that's what he means. He means the ways that the Jews tried to divide themselves from the Gentiles.
So to clarify, Paul wasn't mad that the Jews were trying to work their way to heaven. Paul was mad that they were trying to get the Gentiles to get circumcised and follow all these works that they were doing. Correct? Is that a simple...
Yes and no.
Yes and no? Okay.
They specifically, a lot of what's called the New Perspective was kicked off by this guy named E.P. Sanders, who wrote a book called Paul and Palestinian Judaism. And the main argument in his book was that Jews were not actually trying to earn their way to heaven. Like, even the Jews weren't trying to do that. And he argues it using a lot of first century sources and a lot of sources from the original time. And he argues that the Jews were trying to... the Jews understood that they were just chosen by God through nothing that they did. God picked Abraham and God picked them through nothing they did. And E.P. Sanders and many of the other New Perspective people argue the actions they did, the circumcision, the eating kosher, the things like that. He argues that they didn't even think that was trying to get them into heaven. They thought they were just getting into heaven because they were Jews. He argues that they did those things to clearly show that they were not a part of the nations, to clearly show that there was a distinction, and to clearly show that they were a part of that chosen people of God. And so in some ways, E.P. Sanders argues that even the Jews themselves believed that they were chosen by grace. It's a gift, not something they earned, and that the works they were doing was just the way that they showed that they were a part of that group that was chosen by people. Since that book came out, several other people have kind of expanded upon that, and the main thing that they've argued in has been what Noah was saying. The issue for Paul, because Paul makes a big point often that he's a missionary to the Gentiles, and so the issue for Paul is not some sort of like trying to earn your salvation problem. The issue for Paul is a group of people who are trying to draw clear boundaries and walls and divide themselves from the Gentiles, even after Jesus has already brought those two groups of people together. And so they argue that Paul's problem was racial division, and unity was what he was instead trying to argue for. There's lots of nuance to that. There's lots of different ways you can go into it. But that started with this guy, E.P. Sanders. There's been a few other guys since then. Scott McKnight is part of that. N.T. Wright, who we mentioned several times in this podcast and others, is a part of that group.
Jimmy Dunn.
And those are probably the main ones that kind of represent a lot of that perspective. And they each have their own nuances and their own different ways of looking at it and their own things that they would disagree with, even what I just said before. But ultimately, for everyone in the New Perspective, their belief is that the Jews didn't think they were earning their way to heaven. They thought that these markers were just a way they could divide themselves from the Gentiles, and that's what Paul is mad about.
Yeah.
So to make sure I'm getting to make sure I'm getting what you're saying, so I understand the New Perspective point. When Paul is talking about not by works, he's wanting them to stop focusing on that separation, that division that they're making between we are the Jews
and you guys are the Gentiles.
You guys are so I think that to connect that with other passages of Paul in a way is there is no Jew, there is no Gentile.
Right.
He's trying to get away from that, and that's his message.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a big verse for the new perspective.
Yeah.
Is that verse in Galatians where Paul says there's no longer a Jew, no longer a Gentile. The new perspective is a group of people that really do say that that was like the thing for Paul. There's no longer Jew, no longer Gentile. So if you're trying to do things to make yourself clearly Jewish and separate yourself from everybody else, then that's a problem. Now, even as I'm describing it, I'm sure you guys who know Scripture are thinking of specific passages. You're like, I don't know. That doesn't really
like, yep.
sound. That doesn't really sound right to me. I don't really know that that's what it's talking about. And I'll admit that I'm the same way. Me and Noah have talked about this for a long time. There are aspects of the new perspective that we think have brought on some really good nuances, but overall, we do think that they don't. There's several things that they don't completely get right. One of those things is that book that kind of kicked everything off, the Paul and Palestinian Judaism by E.P. Sanders. Since then, that book has been pretty discredited in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Not the historical part of it, though, right? The part about it where he proves that the Jews
weren't trying to earn their way
to heaven. That's for certain.
That
right?
No.
Okay.
That has been called into question.
Oh, that has been. Okay,
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and so there have been even some archaeological things that have been found that makes it hard to argue that the Jews didn't think they were earning their way to heaven. It is not as cut and dry as the Reformers thought it was, but there are some arguments that the Jews believed that the actions they were doing was going to be rewarded with
Heaven.
paradise.
Yeah.
And if you didn't do these actions, you were going to be condemned for it. So the case isn't as strong as it used to be because of that. And that's why it's important, too, to mention that when E.P. Sanders wrote his book was right after World War II and right after the Holocaust. And so a lot of people believe that it really caught on so well because people felt so guilty about what had happened to the Jews and felt really guilty about how we had been talking about the Jews. You've probably heard preachers talk about Jews this way. They were legalists and they only cared about rules, and we're the good people who believe in faith and we don't believe in works like these Jews. It is unfortunate, but that sort of thinking in the church was you can find it in a lot of the Nazi defenses for why they treated the Jews the way they did. And so E.P. Sanders comes along and he's like, no. Even the Jews believed in grace. They weren't trying to earn their way to heaven. Everyone was really like, yes, we want that because it's like a way to help defend the Jews. And so, again, as a whole, I would say that there's already been enough coming out that has brought a lot of the new perspective into question. But the main thing that the new perspective did really, really well is it did, one of the points they did make pretty clear is that it does seem that when Paul says works of the law, he is referring to specific things related to Torah, not just all of human striving and everybody who's trying to earn their way
Not
to
just
heaven.
working to heaven.
Yeah. They defend that really well. There's a book that came out recently where this guy goes to the early church, people 100, 200, 300 AD, just right after the church started. And he went and looked at every time they used the word works or works of the law. And in context, almost every time they talked about it, what they were talking about was Sabbath, eating food, eating kosher, things like it's they have probably pretty rightly argued that Paul has in mind the Jewish works, not just like all human striving and all that kind of stuff. And that criticism, I think, is valid and
still holds up.
Still holds up in some ways. There are questions later on, though, of what does that, if he is talking about specifically the Jewish works, then
and
expand that a little.
I'll stop here and say, is there any questions anybody has or any thoughts?
I guess I was thinking about certain things. Like, I can kind of see how even the Jews in the Old Testament figured they were saved by grace instead of works by the law, because you kind of think about how Abraham, like, it's just kind of, it wasn't anything Abraham did because he wasn't even Jewish. He was from, like, what was he from, like, land in Canaan or something?
Ur of the
Chaldeans.
Chaldeans.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so it's like God just called him. Well, not even him first. Like Terah, I think his father Terah started to move, and then when his son passed away, and I can't think of his son's name. It was something with an N. What was it? Nahor passes away, and then at that point, it's kind of like, and then at that point, it was just kind of like, okay, Terah stops the move, and then Abraham gets the call, and it's like it wasn't anything they were doing. God just called him, and so, and at that point, it was like, well, he didn't do anything to get that call. He didn't do anything to deserve that, and neither did the seed. And I guess if you think about all the different mistakes that they did make, and God always finding a way to bring them back, like no matter what, no matter how long it took, whether it was 400 years in Israel, in Egypt, or 70 years in Babylon, like whatever it was, he always found a way to bring them back. But I guess on the opposite side of it, I can see how people feel like, okay, well, you still had to work to get saved, because I think about, Deuteronomy and how it lists, like, if you do all these things, then you have blessing, but if you do this, then you will be cursed, type of thing. And so so you can kind of see both, and you see where the New Perspective people are like, it's not like Abraham is saved because he was such a good person. God just picked Abraham. And the Jews really believed that they were just chosen. It's not necessarily that they were better than the Canaanites or the Egyptians or the Assyrians. It's not like the Jews were like, we're better people, that's why God saved us. They did understand that God chose the Jews through his own goodness.
They rested more in election for their salvation as opposed to their own good works.
And I think God even tells them that. He's just like, I didn't choose
I didn't pick you.
I didn't pick you because you were the best nation or because you were righteous. Like, so he was just like, I basically, he picked you because of himself, because of his own righteousness, because he wanted to elevate his name. Because at that point, they were still being disobedient. So God kind of comes back in Deuteronomy. It's like, this isn't about you all. This is about me and elevating the name of God.
Right. So that pivot's great to when that all hit the fan, basically. The next question was, well, why, if Paul is not mad at the Jews for trying to work their way to heaven, why is he so mad at them for just following their Torah laws, right? Because Paul's a Jew himself. And so a lot of these academics were like, well, if he's not mad at them for trying to work their way to heaven, then why is he so mad? And that is what opened up the door for all the different ways of trying to understand and answer that question.
Right. And so the New Perspective answered that question by saying he's mad at them because they're dividing the church, and division is bad, unity is good. That's what they said. That was the reason he... and there are some good arguments for that, which I made on Sunday. Jesus, right before he dies, what he most cares about is unity for the church. Paul, if you actually look at how often he mentions unity language, it's in every letter all the way through. It's obvious that it's super, super important to him. But the second thing you brought up is a good segue into what some of the other perspectives that have come up since the New Perspective. There's another perspective.
There are more perspectives.
They call it the radical New Perspective, or the new perspective, which is even more extreme than the.
They're
old
really
New
great with the names, aren't they?
This one I would actually more likely call Paul within Judaism. Is the term that it's been used for it a little bit, for this radical new perspective. And it goes back to your question about, well, what about like Deuteronomy and like Numbers and Leviticus and all of these rules that they were having to follow?
Because the old perspective would have said, all those books, chuck them, because grace has come now, so we don't have to follow Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Those are done and over with. And this new perspective that you're going to say is going to challenge that, right? Right.
Because their big argument was similar to the New Perspective, where they're just trying to defend the Jews, really, for a lot of them. A lot of times we have been very hard on the Jews, and they were just trying to be like, were they really just legalists who were just trying to earn their way to heaven, or was there more like logic to what they were doing? And so this perspective, called Paul within Judaism, has like three main things that they argue. One thing they argue is that Paul himself never left Judaism. That's why they call it Paul within Judaism. They argue that Paul continued to also do works of the law and Torah and everything else. They defend that by using examples of, like, when Paul goes back to Jerusalem, he does go back into the temple and give sacrifices and stuff like that.
And he also circumcises Timothy.
And he does circumcise Timothy, which they bring up. And they also bring up that in their arguing, Paul seems to be okay if the Jews want to keep doing works of the law. His problem is with Gentiles doing works of the law. And so their argument is that both Paul and the Jews could keep doing all the Torah stuff. That was not a problem. That's not, like, counter to the gospel. But that Paul was upset that they were trying to turn Gentiles into following the works of the law. And they defend that a little bit by making some really interesting defenses of why the works of the law that they talk about, things like circumcision, things like eating kosher and resting on the Sabbath and different things like that,
So I guess that
were logical. Yep.
I guess that makes me ask the question then, I guess, if he was upset, I guess if he didn't want the Jews to get the Gentiles to do it because it was more of like a cultural thing and not like a religious thing. You know, like every culture has their thing that makes it what it is, but that doesn't have anything to do with their relationship with God.
Right.
So it's just like the Jews can continue to do all those things, but you don't need to force them to do that because
That's cultural.
that's like
not religious.
cultural. It's got nothing
You're
to do with their
killing it.
salvation.
Yep,
That is spot on.
That is the summary.
That is
of
exactly what Paul within Judaism people say. They say the Torah is not about religion necessarily; it's about culture. And Paul is fine with them keeping their culture. He just doesn't want them to force their culture on the
other
Gentiles.
people.
Um,
And that also, sorry, I didn't mean to cut
No, you're good.
That's good.
But I think that also reminds me of, I guess, what Noah was saying about, well, why was they asked the question about, well, why was God so mad about them doing the works of the law if it, you know, I guess if that was not an issue. What were you saying?
So why is Paul so mad at the Jews specifically for doing the works of the law, right?
And they would argue that Paul is not mad at the Jews. He's only mad at the Gentiles for doing works of the law.
Yeah.
Would this perspective in particular be also in the Paul is mad at the Jews forcing the Gentiles salvation based off what they are doing?
Yes.
Don't force the Gentiles to be Jewish. Let them do Christianity
The way
they need to.
Right.
Yeah, no, you're spot on.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And so that view is good.
What'd you have? you had a butt. You had a butt there.
You do have a butt, so maybe I'll hit it. This is the main one me and Noah both have.
It may be a little straight off, but I guess it reminded me of what God was saying to the Jews in the Old Testament. There was like a verse where he was talking about how they were making the sacrifices and following the law, but he was like, this is not pleasing to me. And I think also the issue with God was like, I don't care if you make all the sacrifices and, you know, celebrate the new moons and, you know, follow the calendar dates, but your heart is far from me. It's like, I guess his goal was like trying to get his people to be like him. And it's like, if you're following all the laws, but you're not like me, I don't care that you're following the law because you're like missing the whole point of what I'm trying to get you to do, I guess.
And that's a perfect point to, I think, summarize where we do finally land at the end.
Yeah.
So the one thing I'll say, because again, this is the Paul within Judaism, the new perspective of Paul. Their big difficulty that both like me and Noah pointed out is the book of Hebrews. If you read the book of Hebrews, which is clearly written to Jews, it seems to be arguing that even Jews need to quit with the temple sacrifices and the things because the sacrifice of Jesus is enough not only for the Gentiles but also for the Jews and everybody together. So for both of us especially, just reading the book of Hebrews enough to be like, I don't know about this.
Which is kind of convenient because Hebrews is not considered written by Paul in this camp.
About to bring that up.
So it's convenient because all these Pauline scholars can quote from all the Paul stuff and say, see, Paul is saying this, but
and the Hebrews writer is saying something different.
The Hebrews writer is saying something different.
I was gonna mention the idea that there are several scholars that are now thinking well, Paul's not the one who wrote Hebrews,
Right.
which would land this group that's specifically saying we believe, Paul within Judaism. That means Hebrews is not in what we're
Yeah.
talking about.
Right. Exactly.
And so and you got it. So
Yep.
everybody has their own ways to wiggle out of the main arguments.
Yep. Mhm. Yep.
For us, that doesn't hold up because even if Hebrews is not written by Paul, which we have no way of knowing who wrote it, because there's not an author mentioned in the beginning of the book of Hebrews, it is still in the Bible, and I firmly believe that the Bible does not contradict itself throughout. So I believe Paul was right in the things he was saying, so he couldn't have said something here that then the writer of Hebrews is going to go and say the opposite of.
Right.
Yeah.
So for us, the book of Hebrews just kind of nixes that whole radical new
Nixes that
perspective.
belief. Yeah.
And just a simpler one argument from maybe the book of Acts is, like you said, he does circumcise Timothy, but he does not circumcise Titus.
Nope.
And I
Sure,
think
yeah.
that gets looked over sometimes. Is like
Conveniently.
Titus was also just as Jewish as Timothy was. And if Paul thought there's no issue, Jews can keep doing their thing, then why did he not go on and say,
You-
So I
you
guess
meant-
I had a.
Oh.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
so
you're
I
good.
guess it makes me think that why he circumcised Timothy, not Titus, if they were both Jewish. So was it like their own personal?
No, they were both Gentiles, I think,
Oh,
right?
they were both Gentiles.
they were
Yeah.
both half and half.
Half,
Yeah,
half
that's
and
what
half.
they're
Oh.
half.
Okay.
They both had one parent that was Gentile and one parent
That's
that was
right. That's
Jewish.
right. Yeah.
So I guess it makes me feel like maybe he did that based on their own personal preferences. I don't know.
There's
I don't know.
that could be a really interesting argument as to why did he circumcise one and not the other.
Well, and you had a good point about Romans 14 that I think you should probably bring up here.
Oh yeah, I just had that pulled up. I wanted to bring that up.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about that when he, because it's one of my favorite things that Paul says when he talks about the weak and the strong, like, accept the one whose faith, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but just
Right.
basic points, like accept the one whose faith is weak without quarreling over disputable matters. One person's faith allows them to eat anything, but another's whose faith is weak eats only vegetables, and that's verses 1-2. Then you skip down to 5 and says one person considers one day more sacred than another considers every day alike. Each of them should be fully convinced in their own mind, and whoever regards one day as special does so to the Lord. Whoever eats meat does so to the Lord, for they give thanks to God, and whoever abstains does so to the Lord and give thanks to God. So I guess it kind of reminds me of what we were talking about. It's the issue that it's sort of like we have a difference of opinion about how to interpret text or what we're supposed to do to please God, but at the end of the day, that's who we're doing it for. We're doing it for God, and we don't need to get into these minimal things that create division and separate us from unity because we don't all agree on how something should be interpreted. Because like even now, some people have disagreements about when you should go to church because some people think Sunday is the last day, some people
Yeah.
think Saturday is the last day, and so it's just kind of like, well, don't let those little matters get in the way of being unified because we're all serving God. So
Yep. No, that's good. And so that Romans 14 passage, I think, would be a good way to explain why does Paul go to the temple and give a sacrifice at one point, but then at a different point tell a guy, you don't have to be circumcised. Don't worry about it. He says he becomes all things to all people.
Yeah.
Is what he says. He says, I'm going to become like a Jew to the Jews. I'm going to become like a Gentile to the Gentiles. So for Paul, I think it had to do with just his missionary work. He's trying to spread the gospel as much as possible. So if getting Timothy circumcised meant it would spread the gospel easier and help maybe the weaker brothers, then he was like, yeah, that's fine, let's do it. But in a different situation, he might just be like, you know what? We don't have to do this anymore. Let's not continue.
Yeah,
doing it.
I was definitely I was about to bring that section up.
Yeah.
He takes on what he needs to without what's the word? Taking away from his truth and his message.
Right.
Like he's not trying
Right.
to contradict himself. But 1 Corinthians 9:20 is the section that is one of the sections. I lived like a Jew to bring the Jews to Christ. And the same way he goes on to be
Yep.
like, and to the
And to
Gentiles, I
Gentiles.
did the same.
That's
Yeah.
a great one, man. That's a perfect
And
explanation of what he was probably doing.
yeah, and so I feel like that could also be a Timothy Titus kind of scenario that you were kind of saying. Is like Timothy may have needed to be that circumcised to help a group of people that Paul knew he would be ministering to, and it would just make it easier. Another place in the scripture that says, don't be a stumbling block.
Yes.
So the question, though, that we do have to go through from there is from the Romans 14. He does say there are strong people and there are weak people, implying that one is more right than the other, but you can allow the weak person to, still. So the question still stands, what's the strong belief about Torah and the law, and what's the weak view of Torah and the law?
And which is a good segue into the last of the four, I would say, which is probably the one that me and Noah are the closest to. We still, because we're just annoying and we don't ever agree with everybody, there's still aspects of this that we don't agree with, but there's definitely aspects of this view that is the one we like the most, which is generally called the apocalyptic Paul.
So we have new perspective, new perspective, or Paul and Palestine.
Well, you have old perspective.
Oh yeah,
new perspective,
new perspective,
new perspective,
new perspective,
and apocalyptic perspective.
Once you get past new, it always ends up apocalyptic.
That is beautiful.
And the key to understand with apocalyptic, when we hear the word apocalyptic, we think end of the world. We think,
Zombie movie,
post-apocalypse. Everything's terrible. They are using this term more in the way a Greek person would have used the word. The Greek word is apocalypso, which means to have your eyes opened. In a revelation.
Yeah, like the book of Revelation.
For something to be revealed. So you got it covered. You take the cover off. Suddenly it is revealed. The main argument of the apocalyptic camp is that what Paul is saying that there were mysteries that were hidden before that we did not completely understand. And there are certain things that were allowed for a time because we didn't completely understand them and because the rules were different back then. When Jesus came on the scene, he did something that changed the rules for everybody for all time. And what he did is he revealed this new way of living. And so you guys can probably think of a lot of passages immediately that probably do.
I was actually thinking. I was thinking about this yesterday, and I was like, doesn't that sound kind of something that Jesus said sounded contradictory to the New Testament, where he talks about, like in the New Testament, like I think Moses is giving the law in Deuteronomy, and he specifically says, like, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and that's like allowed, like, legally. But then Jesus comes back in the New Testament and says, well, I know that you've heard an eye for a tooth for a tooth, but now I say, like, if your brother wants your clove, give him your tunic also. If he wants to walk with you a mile, like, go with him too. Like, if he slaps you on the cheek, like, turn the other cheek to him. And it's just like, that doesn't seem like it lines up with the Old Testament. So
it's hard because in that same passage, Jesus also says, I did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And he even goes so far as to say, not a single dot or tittle, which is like the smallest little marks that you can make in Hebrew for the letters, will be changed in the law all the way through. And so it's hard because he says that, but then you have Paul that does seem to throw out so much of what the Gentiles are supposed to live. And
so unfortunately there are some people that do start to feel like Paul is saying something different than Jesus.
Right.
And like they're at odds with each other. I've heard some people in certain churches even say stuff like that, and they feel like Jesus came and Jesus was like, I'm not abolishing the law, I'm fulfilling it. And then Paul comes along, and there is actually a passage where Paul uses the terms for abolishing with the law. So in some ways it does feel like Paul
Ephesians 2:15, we actually just read it.
And so in some ways it does feel like Paul is saying something different. I'll read 2:15. I'll start in 14. For he himself is our peace, meaning Jesus, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands, and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself new humanity out of the two, thus making peace.
So it's like the that's
the
that's,
barriers removed, and like you said, 2:15 is the one where he says he set aside in his flesh the law with its commandments.
Right.
And so in some ways they're saying Paul is saying the opposite of what Jesus was saying.
Right.
So how do you reconcile those two? And that's been the question a lot of people have asked. And this is where I've enjoyed the apocalyptic view the most, because what they are arguing is that Jesus came to do something very specific, and that the requirements of the law needed to be met. So somebody had to do it. And Jesus did. We all know that. We all believe that Jesus actually did meet all of the requirements of Torah that the Jews were unable to do for so many years. And the question is, when he did that, what happened? And I think that what the apocalyptic perspective is arguing, that by him fully fulfilling the law, doing it the way it needs to be done, and through his death and resurrection, which the theology of all of that could get really
that's dicey. We're talking about Paul,
through
not
all
Jesus.
of that, through all of that, the argument is that Jesus has actually changed the way the world works,
right,
and the way we relate to God.
Yeah.
And they argue that this is what Paul is trying to tell people. Paul is trying to tell people everything is different now. Everything has changed. Why would you keep doing the law? Jesus fulfilled it. Everything has been changed. And one of the biggest arguments for the apocalyptic group is the passages that talk about at the crucifixion, the curtain being torn, because the curtain kind of represented this division between God in heaven and human beings on earth. And obviously at Jesus' death and his crucifixion, something changes, which is represented by that curtain being torn.
So is that like to say, going back to the mystery not being revealed, is that because that veil was up, there were certain things that we just couldn't know? Like either because God wasn't ready for us to know, or we couldn't know because we didn't have the freedom to, enter the throne room boldly or come to him about things. And now that it's been taken down, it's like, okay, now we can, now I can reveal things to you that you were not able to know, that you weren't ready to know, or something like that.
Right.
And there's all kinds of aspects of what that mystery would be that has kind of been revealed. So there's lots of different ways that this apocalyptic view
plays out.
But for us, one of the biggest things about it, the reason I like it so much, is that it does take seriously the fact that Jesus actually did something at the crucifixion, like something changed. The world is different now than it was before.
It's harder with the other two views because it really just boils down to Jesus died on the cross to unify everyone.
Yes.
And that sounds very weak.
It's like, why do you have to die
why
for that?
Why do you have to die to unify everyone,
And so we enjoy the apocalyptic perspective because it argues that Jesus changed things for everybody, for the whole world. And we think that that is what Paul is now arguing and wrestling with in his letters. He thinks everything is different. He thinks everything has changed. So what does that mean for Jews who were circumcised? What does that mean for Gentiles who are not circumcised? What does that mean for men? What does that mean for women? What does that mean for slaves? What does that mean for masters of slaves? And that's what we really see Paul doing throughout his letters, is that he is really feeling like the world is in a new place, and he is working out what's new about it. What does that newness actually look like?
And for him, that newness looks like Jews can live their way and Gentiles can live a different way. And that's kind of the change, was Jesus on the cross that established that. Right?
I wouldn't say that.
Okay.
I think he's actually trying to get Jews to quit living the way they do sometimes.
Okay, so you do think that, he's trying to keep them from going down that path.
That's kind of, again, another different argument for where we could go. Like I said, we could go way in the weeds with all of this, but my main thing I really wanted to emphasize is, one, there's a lot of other views out there, and so you guys can go and Google any of these topics, and there's good Wikipedia articles that go a lot more in depth on what each of them are about, so I would encourage you to go do that. I think it's helpful to know that these other perspectives exist, because I think a lot of pastors don't know these other perspectives exist because they don't read some of the new like academic books and stuff like that. But a lot of the people that pastors quote are being influenced by all of these perspectives. So if we don't know what's lying behind all of that, it's hard for us sometimes to be like, why are they saying that way? And we can sort of, I know a lot of pastors who unintentionally are saying new perspective stuff, even though they didn't know it was new perspective.
And I will say, just to give another practical point to all of this, a huge attack has been made on the old perspective by non-Christians recently, particularly with Jesus on the cross, and they will argue that the old perspective sounds a lot like an angry father that decides to murder his own son so that he's no longer angry anymore. And why would I want to serve a God if that's what your good news is?
And
you know?
Can you repeat the old perspective again?
The old perspective is that Jesus died on the cross in replacement for the death that we deserved. Like we deserved to be punished for our sins, and instead Jesus took our place and died on the cross for our sins in that very what's the word? I can't think of the word right now.
Transactional.
Transactional, thank you. Yeah. Transactional way where God's angry, God has to release his wrath on something, and so he releases his wrath on his own son as opposed to Jesus.
And I'm not arguing that that's a completely wrong way to look at it.
Right.
That I'm not arguing that we've just all been wrong for forever. And the church didn't get anything figured out until 1950 when E.P. Sanders wrote The New Perspective on Paul. I think my main point with bringing up all of these is, like I said, one, I just want to make people aware that these arguments are out there and that they're interesting. You should go read them. Sometimes there are certain verses that you're like, this doesn't fit in the way I was taught that the Bible works. Don't like pursue that. Don't just like leave that there.
Right.
And that's pursuing verses that we kept finding that didn't quite fit with the way we were brought up in church is what led me and Noah to discover so many of these other perspectives. And the other reason I wanted to bring them up is just I do think each of them make a good point that can really help us to understand Paul better.
Right.
I don't think any of them are completely correct, but I think each of them bring up different points that helps us understand Paul. So I think one thing the old perspective does do really, really well that it brings up is that I do think it is clear from Paul that we have all messed up. Gentiles, Jews, everybody. Nobody deserves heaven. I do think that is very clear from the old perspective, and I think it's very clear that that's what Paul is saying. I'm a sinner, you're a sinner, the Jews are sinners. We clearly do not deserve anything that God gives us, and it is a gift. It's a gift that God gave us. And I think that has been a huge thing that the old perspective helped us to understand. What the new perspective helped to nuance a little bit is that that doesn't necessarily mean that God doesn't care what we do. Because that's the danger of the old perspective. I see this a lot. Because the old perspective is what everybody's used to, I see a lot of Christians out there who are like, I'm just going to go drink and smoke and have sex and do whatever I want because works don't matter, only faith matters.
I seem to remember Paul arguing against that somewhere.
And he does.
A few times.
Yes. And so the new perspective did a really good job of saying, let's make sure we understand what Paul means when he means works of the law. He is, in a lot of times, talking about things that the Jews were doing. But there are some things we can learn about that can apply to everybody. And one thing the new perspective is really good at helping to defend is that God still cares about what we do. Your actions are important to God. It's not just, I believed, I went up, I prayed a prayer, I'm saved, I'm good. God still cares about what you do. The new perspective helped to balance that against the old perspective.
Yeah, that's a great way of summing it up.
And then the other two, I'll just finish real quick. The Paul within Judaism, one thing that I do think it did really well is it helped to show that the Jews weren't just making stuff up. They were doing the best that they could to follow the law. And the reality is a lot of us probably would have done the same things as them, knowing what we had known from them. And so one thing I do think it does really well, I do think this is super important. Sometimes when we read the Bible, we always think of the Jews as the enemies. And it's really easy for us to be like, I'm better than them. At least I'm not a Jew. And I think the Paul within Judaism camp was very good at being like, you're not really any better than them. They were doing the best they could in a lot of the same ways that we were. And then the apocalyptic point, the only thing I think is great to emphasize from it is I do think Jesus really did do something that changed the world for everybody, Jew, Gentile, everybody. And that apocalyptic view, I will say, if you guys ever if you've ever been uncomfortable with that sort of view that like God is just angry and he had to just punish somebody or else it couldn't work, the apocalyptic view is a good one to go look at and understand. The apocalyptic view, I think, is one of the best at explaining what happened on the cross. In that moment. Why did the cross atone?
Why did Jesus have to die?
Yes.
That question.
Yeah, and I was going to say something about that because I don't fully understand the apocalyptic view because I've never really. This is my first time really hearing all the different perspectives. But I guess my perspective on that for those who I guess attacking the old view and saying that God was just so angry and that he needed to take his anger out on someone and Christ had to be that person. I guess the way I look at it is that I don't think he was still angry at that point. I think. Not to say that he wasn't, but I think that the way I look at it is that like when you're committing a sin, it's not something that people just see you do, but it's something that's very spiritual, and that things in the spirit realm last eternally, but things in this world don't. And so because that sin was lasting eternally, something eternal had to happen to cover it. And so that was where the blood on the cross came. That's just my personal perspective. So it's just... something had to be done to cover that eternally because it wasn't like I'm not mad about it anymore, but it's still there and we have to deal with it. Right. And so a good way we can save that particular question for another deep dive. Yeah, we don't have to do it right now, but I do think that would be a good one to tackle, look at some point. Why did Jesus have to die? Yeah. How does the blood of Jesus do anything different? If it is true what the apocalyptic perspective is saying, which is that the world is changed. Why is that, and how did that happen? Yeah, that would be a cool one to.
Yeah, I think that would be fun to do. We are running out of time, so we got to wrap up here. Is there any final thoughts before I make my awkward way out and Jacob reminds everybody of the announcements?
One of the really good things to just keep in mind with all the different perspectives that are out there and everything is the idea that you don't have to settle with one. No. Because something that we've pointed out in all of them, there is something that all of them get really right. Yeah. And they bring up...
and really wrong.
There are things that get really wrong, too.
Yeah. Very much.
But the really good thing about seeing them is if you've always seen Paul in one way, you can get a more fuller view of Paul by seeing what these other groups are doing, and you'll get a fuller experience of the Bible, of what Paul is trying to say and his overall message. Not everything may be right in every perspective. My dad has always said this thing: no one denomination has everything figured out, but there's something good in all of them.
Yeah.
And that's great, man. That's a perfect. I think we just need to end on that.
Yeah.
Like I said,
we're not going to end on that because Jacob has to do announcements, and I'm going to make my awkward walk.
Right. But I think the point just being, obviously, this is like nerdy deep dive stuff to the extreme. But the reason we thought it was important is exactly what you're saying, Jacob. It's helpful sometimes to hear things different than just the way you've always heard it. Yeah. And what I have really discovered as I've studied each of these perspectives is that I do feel like every day I'm getting closer and closer to understanding what Paul was actually saying, even if it was really, really confusing. And I wouldn't have got that if I'd only ever stayed in one camp or not the other. Yeah. So we want you guys to have that little bit of that experience too. Now you know a little bit about what's going on in the Bible nerd world. You can go and like brag about it to other people. Yeah. You know more than your pastor, maybe? I don't know.
Don't tell him that.
Just interrupt his Bible study and be like, you're wrong.
Well, the new perspective on Paul actually argues that.
And I will say in closing that tendency is to take one of these perspectives and run with it and be kind of everybody else is wrong and you're right about that. And please don't do that. Don't take any of this today and do that. That's what I did. And I have regretted doing that ever since. So, yeah.
Learn from each of them, take the good stuff, take the bad stuff, and hopefully in the end we will all better understand Paul, and ultimately by better understanding Paul we can better understand both Jesus and what he came to do for us.
Yes, that's awesome. All right, Jacob, what's our announcements once more?
All right, so just to give everybody a reminder, so starting for August and September, we are not doing live streams on Sundays. So we are encouraging everybody, come hang out with us in person. We want to see your faces. We want to say hello. We want to meet the Wayfarers family. And so that's what we're doing during August and September. We want to meet the people that are involved. We want to meet you. And we really enjoy doing the live streams, both, all the time, but it'd be nice to see your faces sometimes. And so if you're a little nervous about how, I got to come meet a bunch of new people, this Sunday is a great way to do that because we're going to be having a meal together. We're calling it the Family Feast Night. We're just going to sit down, we're going to eat together. And you can, get to know each other and talk to everybody that's there and really feel at home with your church family. And so that's going to start at 7 p.m. this Sunday on the Mid-South Christian College campus at 7 p.m. And I really hope to see you there. All right, I think that's it. So we'll see you on Sunday, hopefully.
In person.
If not, we'll see you next week on the Deep Dive live stream.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.